Welcome back to Introduction to iOS Application Development at SSFS. Well, in the last video, we got our clock to update when we entered the foreground, but we realized that they had one major flaw still, and that is once the app was open, it will not update unless the app was quit and started up again. So if you leave the clock app open, the time's not going to update. So we need some way to update that clock on a regular basis without having to wait for some sort of notification event. So let's take a look at the concept of timers and threads and run loops. So a lot of times when you're using an application, it is just waiting for you to do something, whether it's tap a button, swipe somewhere, read information, but your application constantly has to be waiting for those kind of events. And so it's in what's called a run loop. So it's constantly looping, looking for these events, waiting for something to happen, so it can be responsive when something does happen. So it's very critical when you're designing apps that those interfaces should be responsive. When you tap something, you expect the result immediately. So when you tap, so the task begins and it starts running a thread. So think of a thread as a series of steps, one after the other, be executed. Once all those steps are executed, that thread is complete. So NSTimer is a really good way to do a scheduled task without having to have a loop, because loops can sometimes slow your application down. But an NSTimer will execute something at a very specific frequency. And here's a very common use of an NSTimer, the scheduled timer with time interval method. And you can see there's a lot of different arguments. We'll look at each of these in a second, but scheduled timer with time interval is very, very common. And you can see this means how often, which object you're going to specify the NSTimer on. We saw selectors before, what method are you going to run, any optional information, and should it repeat or should it just happen one time. Okay, so now that we have that information, let's go back to our Xcode file and implement that. We're actually going to create a timer as a property. So I'm going to put that up here above our viewDidLoad function. We already have two properties, the time label and an instance of our clock. I'm going to use VAR since our timer is going to change. Timer, and it is of type NSTimer. Now, since when ViewController is instantiated, it's not necessarily going to initialize the NSTimer. We have to create it as an optional. So I'm going to put the question mark in there to make our NSTimer an optional, because the ViewController is not going to initialize that in the beginning. Okay, so we've already seen the scheduled timer with time interval method. If we want to look at in the documentation, we can do NSTimer and see we've got scheduled timer with timer interval. We want the one with the target, selector, user info, repeats, and it gives us information here about the type of information each of these should have. So let's go ahead and get rid of our notification, since we're not going to use that. I'm going to replace it with our, so now we're going to initialize our timer. And it equals, timer equals NSTimer, scheduled timer with time interval. And the time interval is going to be 1 second. We want to clock the interval, update every second. The target is self, because it's the class we want to use. We're still going to use the update time label method, since that will still work. There's no extra optional information, so we can make that nil. And we do want it to repeat every second. And again, let's make this look a little bit nicer. So we will hit enter after all these, so we can see exactly what it's doing. Okay, Now we know that's going to update every second, but if you remember our time style formatter was short style, which only showed us hours and minutes. If we're going to update it every second, we might as well have it show us those seconds. So instead of short style, we're going to set it to medium style. And we can leave everything else the same. And the last thing we're going to do, instead of deinitializing our NS notification center, we're going to deinitialize our timer. And best practice says we're going to make sure that the timer's actually been initialized first. So if let timer equals self dot timer, and again that's called optional binding. We're checking to make sure that that timer is not nil before we deinitialize it. We'll do timer dot invalidate. Okay. Okay. So again, optional binding means check to make sure it has a value. If it does, then we go ahead and invalidate it, remove it from memory. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. See if that looks any better. There's our clock. And you can see now, medium style shows seconds, and it's updating every second because our NSTimer is calling the update label every second. So this seems like it's much more like what we want in a clock application. In our last video of this series, we'll take a look at what happens when we rotate the screen and make sure that everything is laid out correctly.